In the heart of the American countryside lies an old, abandoned farmhouse, shrouded in mystery and steeped in the shadows of a dark past. Join us as we delve into the Father's Day Phantoms, a survival horror story that will leave you questioning the true cost of unresolved guilt and the haunting power of the past. Prepare yourself for a tale of suspense, where every shadow hides a story, and every corner of the house holds a piece of the horrifying truth.
It was a crisp autumn evening when we arrived at the old farmhouse. The drive had taken us through winding, narrow roads shrouded by towering trees, their leaves a mix of fiery red and burnt orange. The air was thick with nostalgia as we stepped out of the car, each of us lost in our own thoughts about the fathers we had lost. Aleph, Zoe, and I, Mike, had known each other for years, our bond solidified by shared memories of our fathers who had all passed away under tragic, yet different circumstances. This trip was meant to honor them, a chance to remember, to laugh, and maybe to heal. But as we stood in front of the house that once belonged to Aleph's family, an uneasy silence settled over us, like a shadow that had followed us from the past. The house was exactly as Aleph had described it, ancient, with wooden beams that creaked under the weight of time. The once grand structure loomed before us, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes watching our every move. Aleph had told us about how the men in his family had a history of unfortunate accidents, all happening around the time of Father's Day. We had laughed it off when he first mentioned it, dismissing the stories as mere coincidence. But now, standing in the dim light of the setting sun, those tales felt more like warnings, chilling in their implications. We spent the first few hours unpacking and settling in, trying to shake off the unease with banter and light-hearted stories about our fathers. Aleph was the first to break the silence, pulling out a bottle of whiskey that had belonged to his dad, pouring us each a glass. "To our dads," he said, raising his glass, his voice thick with emotion. Zoe and I followed suit, clinking our glasses with a mix of reverence and sadness. The whiskey burned as it went down, warming us from the inside, but it did little to ease the growing tension in the room. As night began to fall, we gathered in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The flickering flames cast long, shifting shadows across the walls, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Dinner was a simple affair, canned soup and bread, yet we ate in near silence, the weight of the past pressing down on us. It was Zoe who first noticed something strange. She had been staring out the window, lost in thought, when she suddenly froze, her face draining of color. "Mike, do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I followed her gaze to the window, but there was nothing there, just the darkness of the night, pressing against the glass like a living thing. "See what?" I asked, my voice tinged with confusion. She shook her head, blinking rapidly as if trying to clear her mind. I thought I saw someone out there. A man, standing by the tree." Aleph laughed, though it sounded forced and brittle, like the snap of a twig in the silence. "You're just spooked by the stories, Zoe. There's no one out there." But his eyes betrayed his words, flicking nervously to the window as he spoke. We tried to laugh it off, to brush aside the unease as imagination running wild. But the seed of fear had been planted, and as the night wore on, it began to take root. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of whispered conversations and uneasy glances. We tried to distract ourselves with stories of our fathers, Aleph's dad teaching him how to fish, Zoe's father always cheering the loudest at her soccer games, my own dad's love of woodworking. But each story felt like a reminder of the void they had left behind. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, sending sparks flying into the air, but it did little to dispel the growing chill in the room. It was Aleph who first saw his father. We were sitting in the living room, the fire now reduced to glowing embers, when he suddenly stiffened, his eyes wide with shock. "Dad!" he whispered, his voice barely audible, filled with a mix of disbelief and longing. Zoe and I followed his gaze to the doorway, but there was nothing there. "Aleph, what is it?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest, an inexplicable dread rising within me. He stood up slowly, as if in a trance, and walked toward the door, his movements stiff and unnatural. I saw him. My dad. He was standing right there, looking at me. Zoe and I exchanged a worried glance. Aleph, you've had a lot to drink. Maybe you're just tired, Zoe suggested gently, though her voice wavered with doubt. But Aleph shook his head, his eyes wide and haunted. No, it was him. I know it was him. He walked to the window, peering out into the darkness as if expecting to see his father again. But there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the wind and the oppressive silence that seemed to have settled over the house like a shroud. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour. The house itself seemed to come alive with sounds. The creaking of the floorboards, the groan of the wind through the old wooden beams, the faint echoes of laughter that seemed to drift from the walls themselves. I started to hear whispers, soft, unintelligible words that seemed to come from just beyond the edge of hearing. At first, I tried to ignore them, dismissing them as tricks of the mind, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they were impossible to ignore. I glanced at Zoe and Aleph, but neither of them seemed to hear it, their faces pale and drawn as they huddled by the fire. Zoe found an old box in one of the upstairs rooms, filled with letters that had belonged to her father. They were dated years before her birth, but the handwriting was unmistakably his. As she read through them, her face grew paler, her hands trembling as she held the brittle yellowed paper. These letters, they're about me, she whispered, her voice cracking. But how? They're from before I was born. How could he have known? She looked up at us, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, but we had no answers for her. Only the cold, gnawing realization that something was very, very wrong. As the night deepened, the apparitions became more frequent. Each of us saw our fathers, sometimes fleeting glimpses in mirrors, other times standing silently in the corner of the room, their eyes filled with sadness and longing. They didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming, bringing with it a flood of emotions: guilt, sorrow, regret. It became clear that they were trying to tell us something we had been too blind to see when they were alive. Aleph was the first to break. He confessed that his father's death hadn't been an accident, as we had all believed. He was pushed to it, Aleph said, his voice choked with tears, the weight of his guilt heavy in the air. He couldn't take the pressure, the expectations. I should have seen it. I should have done something. As he spoke, the figure of his father appeared again, standing in the doorway, his face a mask of pain and regret. But this time, there was something different about the apparition, something darker, more malevolent, as if the pain had twisted into something monstrous, something vengeful. Zoe's father had been a strict man, and as the night wore on, she revealed secrets she had kept hidden for years. He was always so hard on me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. I wanted to make him proud, but nothing was ever good enough. And then, when he died, I was relieved. I hate myself for that. Her father's ghost appeared beside her, his expression one of deep sadness, his form flickering like a candle about to go out. He reached out as if to touch her, to offer some form of comfort or absolution, but Zoe recoiled, the air between them thick with unresolved pain and resentment. By the time dawn approached, we were all on the edge of breaking. The house had become a prison, the walls closing in as the spirits of our fathers pressed their grief and anger upon us, their presence suffocating, inescapable. We knew we had to do something, to end this torment before it consumed us. Aleph found an old journal that had belonged to his great-grandfather, filled with stories of rituals and incantations meant to communicate with the dead. Desperate, we decided to try one of the rituals, hoping it would give our fathers the peace they sought, and free us from the nightmare we had unwittingly walked into. We gathered in the living room, the fire now nothing more than a pile of smoldering embers, and began the ritual. The words felt strange on our tongues, foreign and archaic, the air growing colder with each verse. The spirits of our fathers appeared around us, their eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow, anger, and hope. As we chanted the final line, a sense of calm began to fill the room, the oppressive weight lifting as if the very walls had exhaled a breath they had been holding for centuries. But just as we thought it was over, something changed. The shadows on the walls began to shift, forming into shapes, figures that weren't our fathers, but something else entirely. I watched in horror as the shadow of my father moved across the wall, his face contorted in a look of pure despair. And then, as the final words of the ritual left my lips, the truth hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. The figure on the wall wasn't just a shadow. It was a memory, one that I had buried deep within my mind, hidden even from myself. I reached out to touch it, my hand trembling as the realization washed over me. The image on the wall was of my father, but it wasn't the moment of his death. It was the moment of his betrayal. My betrayal. I had always blamed myself for his death, but the truth was far worse than I could have imagined. As my fingers brushed against the cold surface, I felt a pull, as if the memory was dragging me into the past, forcing me to relive the moment over and over again. The realization hit me like a wave. I had been the one who caused all of this. I was the reason my father, Alef's father, Zoe's father, all of them had met their tragic ends. And now, as the shadows closed in around me, I knew there was no escape. The final words of the ritual echoed in my mind as I was pulled into the darkness, the truth searing itself into my soul. I wasn't just facing the ghosts of my father. I was the ghost, the true cause of all their pain, and there was no way to atone for the sins of the past.
As you reflect on the eerie events that unfolded in the Father's Day Phantoms, remember that the past has a way of haunting those who refuse to confront it. Have you ever felt the weight of unresolved guilt, or seen something out of the corner of your eye that made your heart race? The spirits in this story remind us that some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how hard we try to forget. If you found yourself captivated by this chilling tale, share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that will keep you up at night. And if you're ready for more spine-tingling scares, we've selected a video about 4 urban legends scary stories just for you. It's appearing on your screen now. Remember to subscribe.